6 young women knelt in the dirt outside Jonah's ranch, their faces streaked with tears and dust, their bodies trembling like autumn leaves in a killing frost. But the man they begged for help, a man named Jonah who had once worn the star of a U.S. Marshal, hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 long years. He had built a fortress of silence around his heart, and what these women were about to ask of him would force him to choose between his carefully guarded solitude and a past more dangerous than any loneliness. The sun beat down mercilessly on the remote, high-desert valley where Jonah had built his exile. His weathered, capable hands gripped the porch railing as he stared at the impossible, heartbreaking sight before him. 6 figures in torn, travel-stained dresses kneeling like broken dolls against the vast, indifferent backdrop of his endless fence line. The youngest couldn't have been more than 17, the oldest maybe 25. His throat felt like sandpaper. 3 years since he'd heard a human voice that wasn't his own, a harsh, guttural sound echoing back from the canyon walls. 3 years since he'd deliberately and methodically chosen this existence, cutting every single tie that bound him to the world of men, a world of laws, lies, and failures. The nearest town was a grueling 2-day ride through treacherous, waterless terrain. No one, absolutely no one, came here by accident, yet here they were. The one with the fiery auburn hair, clearly their leader, raised her head first. Her green eyes, even from this distance, held a desperate, intelligent fire that he recognized, a look he had spent years trying to forget. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a whispered, desperate croak emerged. Her lips were cracked, her face gaunt and hollow with an exhaustion that went beyond mere travel. Whatever had brought them to his door, they had traveled far, and they had suffered much along the way. Jonah felt the carefully constructed walls of his solitude, the walls he had built with his own grief and shame, begin to tremble. Every instinct, honed by a brutal lesson in betrayal, screamed at him to turn away, to retreat into the dark, quiet safety of his cabin and pretend this moment, this impossible intrusion, had never happened. He had learned the hardest way possible that helping others only led to pain, that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford, and that the safest place for a man like him was alone. Always, and forever, alone. But as the auburn-haired woman, whose name he would learn was Clara, struggled to her feet, swaying dangerously, something deep within his chest stirred. It was a feeling he thought he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself it was dead. It was the ghost of the man he used to be, the Marshal who had once believed in protecting the innocent. It was the chilling, painful feeling that maybe, just maybe, running away wasn't the same thing as being safe. The woman took a step forward, her voice a barely audible rasp that was almost stolen by the dry wind. But her words, when they reached him, would shatter the 3 years of silence he had built around himself like armor. And once spoken, once heard, there would be no taking them back. "Please, mister," she begged. "We ain't got nowhere else to go. They're hunting us." Jonah's hands gripped the porch railing tighter, his knuckles turning white against the sun-bleached wood. Hunting. The word was a trigger, a key that unlocked a room in his memory he had nailed shut and tried to burn down. The room was dark, filled with the smell of gunpowder, cheap perfume, and the coppery tang of blood. He saw another woman's face, younger, but with the same fiery, defiant eyes. A girl named Sarah, a desperate plea. A moment when he had made the wrong choice, a choice that had cost not just her life, but his own soul. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. "You need to leave," he called back, his voice rusty and harsh from disuse. "I can't help you." But even as the cold, necessary words left his mouth, his trained investigator's eyes were taking in the details, the evidence that told a story of brutal violence. Clara's dress wasn't just torn from travel, it was shredded in places, particularly at the shoulder and collar, suggesting a violent struggle. Dark, ugly stains marked the fabric, some a rusty brown that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The other 5 women, huddled together in a miserable, trembling group, bore similar signs of rough, cruel treatment. Whatever they were running from, it had already caught up to them once. Clara stumbled forward another step, her hand pressed hard against her side. When she pulled it away to brace herself, Jonah saw fresh, bright red blood seeping through her fingers. His breath caught in his throat. She was wounded, maybe badly, and they all looked half dead from exhaustion and dehydration. "They took our wagon 3 days back," she continued, her voice growing weaker, a thin, thready sound. "Killed our guide. Said they'd do worse if they caught us again." She looked up at him, her green eyes pleading, a final, desperate appeal. "You're our last hope, mister. The only soul between here and the border. Border. The word hit Jonah like a physical blow. These weren't just travelers in distress, they were fugitives, and whatever trouble they carried with them, whatever powerful men were hunting them, that trouble would become his trouble the very moment he offered them a cup of water. He had learned that lesson once before, in the most brutal way imaginable, and it had cost him everything that had ever mattered. But as he watched Clara sway on her feet, her face growing paler by the second, something inside him, the last remnant of the Marshal, the last ember of the man he once was, finally cracked. She was going to collapse. They all were. And if he sent them away now, into that vast, unforgiving wilderness with their injuries and their exhaustion, he would be signing their death warrants just as surely as if he had pulled the trigger himself. Clara's legs buckled. She fell to her knees in the dirt, her blood now a visible growing stain in the pale dust beneath her. The other women rushed to her side, their own weakness forgotten in their desperation to help their leader. Jonah found himself walking down the porch steps before his conscious mind could catch up to his body. 3 years of chosen isolation had taught him many things about survival, but it hadn't, it seemed, killed the part of him that couldn't stand by and watch another human being suffer, not when he had the power to prevent it. But as he approached the huddled group of desperate women, a new sound, a sound he knew all too well, reached his ears. Hoofbeats. Distant but growing closer. Multiple horses, moving fast and with a disciplined rhythm across the hard-panned desert floor. Someone was coming, and they were riding hard. The auburn-haired woman, Clara, heard it too. A fresh wave of pure animalistic terror flashed across her face as she grabbed Jonah's arm with blood-slicked fingers. "They found us," she whispered, her voice a strangled, broken thing. "Dear God, they found us." Jonah looked toward the eastern horizon, where a small, telltale cloud of dust was rising in the distance. Whoever was coming would be here within the hour, and when they arrived, they'd find 6 wounded women who were clearly running from something terrible, and one man, a man who was about to discover that some choices, some debts of conscience can never be undone. That night, his small, solitary cabin was transformed. It was no longer a tomb for his memories, but a makeshift infirmary, a chaotic sanctuary filled with the soft sounds of women's hushed whispers and the sharp metallic smell of blood and antiseptic herbs. As he tended to their wounds, a grim, familiar rhythm from his past, he saw the full, brutal scope of their ordeal. Rope burns, raw and angry, chafed their wrists. Ugly, finger-shaped bruises marred their throats and upper arms. These weren't just fugitives. They were victims, survivors of a profound and sadistic cruelty. He did not ask their story. He knew it was not his place to ask, but as he worked, he found himself watching Clara. There was a fierce, defiant spirit in her, a resilience that reminded him so powerfully, so painfully of Sarah, the young informant he had failed to protect. The familiarity was both a comfort and a source of deep, agonizing, and ever-present pain. Later, after the women had eaten a thin soup he had prepared and had fallen into an exhausted, restless sleep, Jonah sat by the fire, his nightly ritual of grief. He took out the one object he had allowed himself to keep from his past life, the one tangible piece of his failure. It was a silver hair comb, beautifully and intricately made, with a single small piece of turquoise inlaid in the center. It had belonged to Sarah. He had found it on the floor of the safe house after the botched raid, a small, beautiful thing left behind in a room filled with blood and death. He polished it with a soft cloth, his hands moving with a practiced, sorrowful rhythm, a nightly penance for his sins. He was so lost in his memories that he didn't hear Clara approach. She stood in the shadows just beyond the firelight, her own wounds bandaged, her face pale but her eyes clear and sharp. She had been watching him, and as she saw him take out the silver comb, she froze. Her breath caught in her throat, a small, sharp, audible gasp. It was her sister's. It was Sarah's. She had given it to her as a gift for her 16th birthday. Her mind reeled. She had come to this remote, isolated ranch by a stroke of desperate luck, and now she found herself in the home of a man who held the last, precious piece of her murdered sister in his hands. Who was he? Was he connected to her sister's death? Was he one of them, one of the slavers, a man who kept trophies of his victims? Her brief, fragile sense of safety, of gratitude, evaporated, replaced by a cold, wary, and deeply suspicious fear. Before she could speak, before she could demand an answer, a new sound cut through the night. The sound of a large group of horses moving with a disciplined, military precision. The hunters had arrived. But as Jonah looked through a crack in the shutters, he saw not a ragtag group of slavers, but a formal organized posse. A posse of U.S. Marshals, their badges glinting in the moonlight, and at their head rode a man whose face was as familiar and as hated to Jonah as his own reflection, Gideon Cole, a celebrated, heroic-looking marshal, and Jonah's former partner. "Jonah!" Gideon's voice boomed across the yard, a voice of false camaraderie that made Jonah's skin crawl. "We're tracking a group of dangerous fugitives, murderers. They killed a federal agent. We have reason to believe they came this way." Jonah was trapped. Clara was trapped. And in the center of their trap, between a woman who now believed him to be a monster and a man he knew to be a traitor, lay the ghost of a dead girl and the terrible, unspoken truth of the silver comb. Marshal Gideon Cole's voice, a sound of feigned righteousness and hollow authority, echoed across the ranch yard, a stark and unwelcome intrusion into Jonah's self-imposed exile. The sight of his former partner, a man he had once trusted with his life, sitting tall and confident on his horse, was like a physical blow. Gideon was not just a ghost from his past, he was the architect of its ruin, and he had come for the women. "Murderers?" Jonah called back, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, playing for time, his mind racing. "They looked more like victims to me, Gideon." Gideon's handsome, heroic face hardened, the charming mask slipping for a moment to reveal the cold, calculating predator beneath. "That's what they want you to think, Jonah. They're part of a dangerous gang, more dangerous than you can imagine. The agent they killed was a good man. They're fugitives from federal justice." Jonah was now trapped in a terrible, impossible dilemma. He looked back into the dim, firelit cabin. He saw Clara, who had retreated from the doorway, her face pale, her eyes now filled with a cold, wary suspicion directed at him. She had seen the comb. She now believed he was connected to her sister's death. Then he looked back outside at Gideon, the man he knew to be a traitor, a man who had lied and betrayed his way to the top, now cloaked in the unimpeachable authority of the law. Who could he trust? The woman who carried the face of his greatest failure? Or the man who represented the corrupt, broken system he had fled from? He made his choice. It was not a choice born of trust, but of a deeper, more primal instinct to protect the innocent from the man he knew to be a wolf. "I haven't seen any fugitives," he lied, his voice flat and unyielding. "Just a group of scared women who needed shelter from the storm. They're under my protection." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Jonah, don't be a fool. Don't throw your life away for them. You've already lost enough." The words were a veiled threat, a reminder of their shared bloody past, a past only the two of them truly understood. The siege began. Gideon, too smart to risk a direct, bloody assault that would be difficult to explain later, settled in for a war of attrition. He and his posse of marshals, a group of men who believed their commander's lies, established a tight perimeter around the ranch. They were not just slavers Jonah could fight off, they were the law, and they were prepared to wait. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. Jonah was no longer a savior. In Clara's eyes, he was a suspect, a possible accomplice to her sister's murder, a man who possessed a piece of her past that he had no right to. And he, in turn, looked at her and saw not just a victim, but a woman on a quest for justice, a quest that could unwittingly expose him and bring the whole rotten edifice of his past crashing down upon them both. They were trapped together, each believing the other was hiding a terrible, dangerous secret. An alliance of pure, desperate necessity was formed in the crucible of their mutual distrust. As the days of the siege wore on, a strange, tense routine developed. Jonah, the ex-Marshal, the man trained in tactics and survival, took command of their defense. He showed the women how to barricade the doors and windows, how to conserve their food and water, how to stand watch in shifts. He was professional, distant, his commands crisp and clear. Clara, in turn, became the heart of their small, besieged community. She was a natural leader, her fierce, defiant spirit inspiring the other women who had been broken and terrified to find their own strength. She tended to their wounds, rationed their meager supplies, and spoke to them in low, calming tones, her voice a thread of hope in the suffocating darkness. They worked together, Jonah and Clara, as a surprisingly effective team, but always with a wall of unspoken suspicion between them. He would watch her, trying to reconcile the fierce, capable woman before him with the memory of her younger, more vulnerable sister. She would watch him, studying the way he held himself, the deep, abiding sadness in his eyes, the way he would unconsciously touch the pocket where he kept the silver comb, trying to reconcile the image of the cold-blooded killer she imagined with the man who now stood between her and certain death. The first crack in their respective armors came during a failed escape attempt. On the third night of the siege, Clara, now believing that staying with Jonah was as dangerous as facing Gideon, tried to slip away with two of the other women under the cover of a moonless night. Jonah, anticipating such a move, caught them at the fence line. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice a low, angry growl in the darkness. "Away from you," Clara shot back, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "I won't be trapped in a cabin with my sister's killer." The accusation, spoken aloud for the first time, hit him with the force of a physical blow. "I didn't kill her," he said, his voice raw with a pain she did not expect. "Then how did you get her comb?" she demanded. The standoff, a whispered, furious confrontation in the freezing darkness, was interrupted by a rifle shot. Gideon's men had seen them. They were forced to scramble back to the relative safety of the cabin, their mutual distrust now poisoned by an open accusation. The turning point came 2 days later. The siege was taking its toll. Their food was nearly gone, their water low. Gideon's tactics were becoming more brutal, more aggressive, his men firing warning shots that came dangerously close to the cabin walls. Jonah, his face grim, knew that Gideon was trying to provoke a response, to create an incident that would justify a final bloody assault. He knew that Gideon was not just trying to capture Clara, he was trying to kill her, and him, to silence them both forever. That evening, as they sat in the dim, flickering light of the last of their lanterns, Jonah made a choice. He could not let Clara continue to believe he was a monster. He needed her to trust him if they were to have any chance of survival. He walked over to her, his movements slow and deliberate, and knelt before her. He took out the silver hair comb. "This was Sarah's," he said, his voice thick with the agony of a confession he had never intended to make. "I was the marshal in charge of the raid on the safe house where she was an informant. I was her handler. It was my job to protect her." He looked her directly in the eye, letting her see the profound, soul-deep guilt that lived there. "And I failed her." Clara stared at him, her own face a mask of shock and confusion. You were the law?" "I was," he said, his voice a bitter whisper. "I failed her, Clara. The raid was a trap. Someone on the inside betrayed us. My partner was killed. Sarah was killed. And I was the one in charge." He finally revealed the full, ugly truth. "I didn't kill your sister. I let her die." The confession, a raw and honest admission of his failure, was the one thing Clara did not expect. She had prepared herself for lies, for threats, for violence. She was not prepared for this broken, grieving man, a man whose guilt was as deep and as real as her own sorrow. She, in turn, revealed her own purpose, the reason she was on the run. "I'm not a fugitive," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm seeking justice. I know there was a traitor. I was on my way to meet a man, a retired journalist in Santa Fe who can prove it. The man who has my father's old records." They looked at each other, the two halves of a single tragic story, and they both realized the horrifying, unbelievable truth at the same time. The raid had not been a simple failure. It had been a deliberate, calculated betrayal, and the only other Marshal who had survived that bloody, chaotic night, the man who had been hailed as a hero for pulling his wounded partner from the crossfire, was Gideon Cole. Gideon was the traitor, and he was sitting outside their door, waiting to finish the job he had started 2 years ago. The revelation, when it landed, was not a lightning strike, but a slow, cold, and creeping dawn of horror. Gideon, The hero of the Fort Davis raid, the man who had given a tearful eulogy at his partner's funeral, the man who had personally recommended Jonah for a commendation before the official inquiry turned against him. It had all been a lie, a monstrous, brilliantly orchestrated lie. He hadn't been a hero, he had been the architect of the entire massacre. And now, they understood his true, terrifying motive. He was not just hunting Clara to silence her as a witness. He had orchestrated this entire siege, using the full authority of the U.S. Marshal Service to finally locate and eliminate the one other loose end, the one other survivor who might one day remember enough to expose him, his old partner, Jonah. The cabin, which had been a cage of mutual suspicion, was instantly transformed into a war room united by a single burning purpose. The enemy was no longer just a group of faceless slavers or corrupt lawmen. The enemy had a name, a face, and a history that was intimately and tragically tied to both of them. "He played us all," Jonah breathed, the full scope of Gideon's treachery settling upon him like a physical weight. He used the raid to eliminate his own partner, who must have been getting too close to the truth. He silenced your sister, and he used my failure, my guilt, to discredit me and drive me from the service. "He's not just a traitor," Clara said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss, her grief now forged into a hard, sharp blade of righteous fury. "He's a monster, and he has to be stopped." But they were still trapped, hopelessly outnumbered, with no way to get the truth to the outside world. Their only potential ally was the local law, and Sheriff Miller, they knew, was a weak and compromised man. Their situation seemed impossible. It was Jonah, the man who had spent 3 years running from his past, who finally decided it was time to turn and face it. "We can't fight our way out," he said, his mind, the mind of a strategist, now sharp and clear. "So we have to bring the truth here. We have to make this cabin, this ranch, the courtroom." Their plan was a desperate, almost suicidal gambit. It relied on Gideon's arrogance, his belief that he had them completely and totally trapped, and it relied on the conscience of a single weary and frightened old man. They needed to get a message to Sheriff Miller, a message that would force him to finally choose a side. Using a piece of charcoal and the last clean page from a ledger book, Jonah wrote a short, cryptic note. It contained no accusations, no pleas for help. It simply contained a series of numbers and a single, crudely drawn symbol. A detail from the botched raid, a piece of tactical information so specific, so secret, that only someone who had been there, or someone who had been briefed by the true traitor, could possibly recognize it. It was a message designed not to be read, but to be understood. It was a test of the old sheriff's soul. Under the cover of the darkest part of the night, while Clara and the other women created a small diversion at the front of the cabin, a single overturned lantern that caused a brief, contained fire, Jonah slipped out the back. He moved with the silent, spectral grace of the man he once was, a ghost in the darkness, and made his way to the edge of the perimeter. He left the note tucked into the saddlebag of one of the marshal's horses, a place he knew the morning patrol would find it. The final confrontation began at dawn. Gideon Cole, his patience worn thin, his victory assured, strode towards the cabin flanked by his men, ready to issue his final ultimatum. But before he could speak, a new rider appeared, approaching not from the town, but from the west. It was Sheriff Miller. He rode alone, his face pale and grim, his old hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He rode to the center of the yard and stopped, placing himself directly between Gideon's forces and Jonah's cabin. "Gideon," the old sheriff said, his voice a weary, gravelly thing, "this is over. I just sent a rider to Fort Laramie with a full report. The army will be here by tomorrow." Gideon stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into pure, venomous rage. "You old fool," he hissed. "You've just signed your own death warrant." "Maybe," the sheriff replied, his gaze steady. "But I've lived with enough ghosts. I don't aim to add more." He looked past Gideon to the cabin. "The note. It was the call sign for the ambush, wasn't it? The one that got your partner killed. The one that was never in the official report." The trap had been sprung. Gideon, exposed and betrayed, finally dropped all pretense of the law. He drew his weapon. "No witnesses," he snarled to his men. The yard erupted into a chaotic, desperate firefight. But Gideon had made one final, fatal miscalculation. He had assumed his men's loyalty was to him, But their loyalty was to the badge, to the law he had so thoroughly corrupted. When they saw their own commander fire on another lawman, something inside them broke. Two of the younger marshals, their faces a mixture of horror and disgust, turned their weapons not on the cabin, but on Gideon himself. The battle was brief, but brutal. In the heart of the chaos, Jonah and Gideon, the two former partners, the two survivors of a shared, bloody past, finally had their reckoning. It was not a duel of honor. It was a desperate, ugly brawl in the dirt, a fight fueled by years of betrayal and suppressed rage. It ended with Jonah standing over his defeated and broken former partner, the silver hair comb, which had fallen from his pocket during the struggle, lying in the dust between them. The story ends months later. Gideon Cole is in a federal prison, his testimony, combined with the evidence from the journalist in Santa Fe, having exposed a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of the territorial government. The slaving ring is broken. The names of Jonah's partner and of Sarah are cleared, their honor restored. Jonah and Clara stand together on the porch of the small, quiet ranch. The other women have moved on, their freedom secured, their new lives beginning. But Clara has stayed. Their shared loss, their shared victory, has forged a bond between them that is deeper than romance, a partnership built on a foundation of truth and justice. She is helping him run the ranch, which has become a quiet, unofficial sanctuary for others seeking to escape their own pasts. He reaches into his pocket and takes out the silver hair comb. It is no longer a symbol of his failure, but a reminder of a promise finally and completely fulfilled. He holds it out to her. "This," he says, his voice quiet but full of a newfound peace, "belongs to you." Clara takes it, her fingers closing around the cool, familiar silver. She looks at him, her own eyes clear and free of the shadows that had once haunted them. "No, Jonah," she says softly, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. "It belongs to us." She takes his hand, and together they turn to face the vast, open, and hopeful horizon. He is no longer a man running from his past. He is a man who has finally, and bravely, escorted the future of justice home. The Marshal's ghost is a powerful and unflinching look at the nature of guilt and the long, hard road to redemption. Jonah was a man trapped in a prison of his own making. He wasn't haunted by a simple mistake, but by a profound failure of duty that cost two innocent people their lives. His self-imposed exile was his sentence, a life of silence and solitude as penance for a past he believed he could never outrun. His story is a stark reminder of how a single moment of failure can define our entire existence, forcing us into a pattern of self-punishment long after the world has moved on. We all have botched raids in our pasts, moments of poor judgment, of fear, of inaction, that we allow to become the ghosts that haunt our present. Clara's journey is one of righteous fury, a quest for a justice that the system itself had denied her. She is a testament to the incredible strength it takes to keep fighting for the truth when the world and the law has told you to be silent. She carried the memory of her sister not as a burden of guilt, but as a righteous fire, a fuel for her relentless pursuit of the man responsible. What makes their story so profound is that their healing was impossible alone. Jonah was paralyzed by his guilt, and Clara was consumed by her grief and anger. They were two sides of the same tragic coin, each holding a piece of a truth the other needed. Their story teaches us that redemption is rarely a solitary act. It often requires the courage to confess our deepest failures to the very people we have wronged. Jonah's bravest moment was not in a gunfight, but in the terrifying vulnerability of admitting his failure to Clara. And Clara's most powerful moment was not in finding vengeance, but in choosing to see the tormented man behind the symbol of her hatred. Their alliance, forged in a crucible of distrust and desperation, is a powerful lesson in the complexity of human connection. It suggests that sometimes, the only person who can truly understand our pain is the one who is standing on the other side of it. They couldn't erase the past, but by finally facing it together, they were able to rob it of its power. The Marshal's ghost is a reminder that the path out of our own personal wilderness is often found not by running faster, but by finding the courage to turn around and walk back through the fire with an unlikely and perhaps undeserving ally. And so, in a place built on silence and secrets, a disgraced marshal and a vengeful sister discovered that the only way to silence the ghosts of the past is to finally give them a voice. They proved that true justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, but about honoring the memory of the innocent together. Thank you for walking this haunted trail with us, here at Wild West Secrets. If this story of a shared tragic past and the difficult necessary journey to redemption resonated with you, then you have found your posse with us. We are committed to telling the complex stories of flawed heroes and the impossible choices that forge them. To help us continue to unearth these powerful tales, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who understands that we are all haunted by something. And if you never want to miss a secret we uncover, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Now it is your turn to pass judgment. Leave a comment below and tell us, who do you believe was the true villain of this story? The traitor Gideon or the guilt that haunted Jonah? Until our next story, may you have the courage to face your own ghosts, and may you find the partner who helps you walk through the fire. Stay safe out on the trail.